It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host Hannah Feldman. David Feldman is actually out making some money today, so we've got Hannah. Hello, Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And, of course, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello to everybody, especially our listeners.
In our continued coverage of the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict, today we welcome co-founder and president of the Arab American Institute, James Zogby. Mr. Zogby has written extensively about issues in the Middle East, particularly how the Arab world views American intervention in their affairs. He's also managing director of Zogby Research Services, a firm that has conducted groundbreaking surveys across the Middle East. We look forward to talking to Mr. Zogby about the latest developments as well as the history what's going on in that region. Then in the second half of the show, we're going to pivot to a different subject. It's one of our least favorite things, nuclear power. We're going to welcome back no-nukes advocate Harvey Wasserman, a longtime fellow traveler with Ralph in the no-nukes movement. Today, he's going to bring us up to date on the supposed decommissioning of the Diablo Canyon nuclear reactor in Central California. One issue at the core of the nuclear power debate is embrittlement, which is just a wonky way of saying cracking. Mr. Wasserman maintains that embrittlement, quote, may seem obscure, but it's at the center of whether a melting atomic reactor will calmly cool down or explode in a violent planetary apocalypse. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's hear about the latest developments in the Middle East. Hannah?
James Zogby is co-founder and president of the Arab American Institute, and he is featured frequently on national and international media as an expert on Middle East affairs. Since 1992, he's written a weekly column, Washington Watch, that is published in 12 countries. He's the author of several books, including Looking at Iran, The Rise and Fall of Iran in Arab Public Opinion, The Tumultuous Decade, Arab, Turkish, and Iranian Public Opinion, 2010 to 2019, Arab Voices, What They're Saying to Us and Why It Matters, and Palestinians, The Invisible Victims. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, James Zogby.
Thank you.
Welcome indeed, Jim. You've been a long-time spokesperson for the Arab American community and for the national interest of the United States in the Middle East area. And you always provide context for things that are going on. And while the attention is properly focused on the massive convulsions now over there, I want to start the program by quoting a statement from the founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. The early founders, coming off the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews, were in no mood, to respond to the indigenous rights of the Palestinian people. They wanted a state and they wanted a homeland. And David Ben-Gurion was very candid about what happened. And in the book called The Jewish Paradox by Nahum Goldman, who was head of the World Zionist Organization, that came out in 1978, he quotes David Ben-Gurion as follows. And this is very, very important, listeners, to understand the historical context of what's going on now. Here's David Ben-Gurion's quote. If I were an Arab leader, I would never sign an agreement with Israel. It is normal. We have taken their country. It is true. God promised it to us. But how could that interest them? Our God is not theirs. There has been anti-Semitism, the Nazis, Hitler, Auschwitz. But was that their fault? They see but one thing. We have come and we have stolen their country. Why would they accept that? End quote. That's by David Ben-Gurion. And subsequent Israeli leaders have said that if they were Palestinians, they would be involved in the resistance as well, including Ehud Barak, who was a former prime minister of Israel and a fighter in the Israeli army. So I want to ask you, Jim, how do you provide the context to positions taken by members of Congress and Joe Biden and others so they don't just dehumanize Palestinians and focus entirely on Israel, which is now a military, economic, and technological superpower and has been described by its generals as being the most secure time in Israeli history until October 6th, with the failed intelligence system. How do you deal with members of Congress who are already in a huge financial package, billions of dollars, to assist Israel, which has a greater social safety net than we do in the U.S., and is a very modern, prosperous country, and they're going to try to get this through Congress? How do you provide the context?
Well, look, thank you, Ralph, for the opportunity to talk to folks today. I had some meetings with White House officials last week, and I tried to do exactly what you're saying. I started with, of course, that what happened on October 7th was deplorable, condemnable, outrageous, barbaric. I mean, you can use all the words that you can come up with in the English language, and they still don't describe the horror of what happened to Jewish people on that day. I said, and it evoked for Jews around the world the trauma of the Holocaust, which they have come to see as self-definitional because it describes their vulnerability and insecurity. At the same time, what Israel has been doing before October 7th, and most certainly what they've been doing since up till the present day, evokes for Palestinians the trauma of the Nakba, the feeling of expulsion, of the vulnerability that we were in control of our own land. We are no longer, and we are not controllers of our destiny, even of our history, which is being rewritten by folks in the West to describe them as the aggressor instead of as the victim historically. So I said that. I got rebuked by one at the White House who said, I am tired of hearing this whataboutism and trying to equate the two and say Israel suffered but. And I stopped him because I was a little upset. And I said, I never said but. What I said was, there are two narratives, and we have to understand both. There's Israeli trauma and Jewish trauma, and there's Palestinian and Arab trauma. Both are real because there are two groups of humanity who each have histories. When we adopt one and ignore the other, then we end up creating the kind of torment the Palestinians have been living with. Biden is in Israel right now, and listening to his rhetoric can only help say to Palestinians hear it, and they say, he doesn't care about us. He doesn't even see us as real people. This was a love fest for Israel, with Palestinians literally being written out of history, written out of the present day, written out of the legacy of suffering that they've endured. That I can't even imagine the thinking or the lack of thinking that went into sending him on this trip today, especially when you have across the Arab world riots in front of American embassies and hatred being reignited, not only toward Israel, but toward the United States, because we are the enablers and the funders and the supporters and the cheerleaders and coat holders for one side in what has been historically a very bloody and misunderstood conflict. And it's, look, I've been through this myself, as you have as well, for decades now. I mean, all this did was remind me of 67, certainly remind me of 82, when the Israelis marched up to Beirut and did what they did. And then there was, after that, the Intifada and how they responded to it. And then the invasions of Gaza, the attacks on Gaza in 2008 and 10 and 12 and 14 and 21. And then 2006, when they demolished Lebanon's infrastructure because they were going to end once and for all Hezbollah. They ended up making Hezbollah stronger. And so the sort of the PTSD of having been through this and trying to remind people in Congress that this does not make Israel more secure. Taking massive amounts of Palestinian lives, evacuating them, forcing them to flee from their homes, murdering them from the air, doesn't make them more secure. At the end of the day, when the dust settles and the tears dry, you're going to have a whole lot more dead people, a whole lot more anger, a whole lot more frustration, and nothing else will change in Gaza or in the West Bank, where Israelis are running over Palestinians, trying to evict them from their homes and villages, and they're doing it. So there is this history. It has to be understood. I just want to add one quote to Ben-Gurion. He implemented a plan during 48 that was a deliberate plan to evict Palestinians from the areas that Israel wanted to take from them, areas that had not been given to Israel in the UN partition plan. He said that's what they did. They implemented this plan. And at the end of it, he celebrated what he called a double miracle. An Israel, he said, that was larger and had less Arabs. And so it was something that they've celebrated. And these people in Gaza, 80% of the population of Gaza are refugees. And they have this as their history, as their legacy, that they are families of people who were expelled from their homes, and now they're being expelled one more time.
Well, let's provide more history here. We're talking with James Zogby, who is the founder of the Arab American Institute. In 1948, when the UN essentially established the State of Israel in the partition decision, Palestine was formerly a British mandate. It was under control of the British, and Israeli partisans attacked British installations, blew up part of the King David Hotel, and that's all part of the history. But the Palestinians now, 5 million of them are living in the West Bank and Gaza, maybe closer to 6 million, and they're living in only 22% of the original Palestine area. So the Palestine Authority has conceded that Israel is going to control 78%. They have, out of the Oslo Accords, recognized Israel's right to exist. The question is whether Israel recognizes the Palestinians' right to exist. And in Congress, which is the big backer of Israeli militarism, they keep saying Israel has a right to defend itself. But they never say the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. And their innocent casualty tolls of deaths, injuries, diseases from the deprivation and the occupation and property destruction are hundreds of times greater than the loss of innocent Israeli life, hundreds of times greater over the decades. And this raises the question of bigotry and hatred on Capitol Hill and refusal to disavow high Israeli official racist comments, totally genocidal comments over the years that are part of the historical record. You have lectured on the other anti-Semitism before an Israeli university some years ago. Could you describe the other anti-Semitism? Because this is an important aspect of the dialogue here. Any members of Congress who dare speak on behalf of Palestinian rights are accused of anti-Semitism immediately. So can you discuss this? Because you've had many conversations with Israelis over the years, and you know quite a bit about the other anti-Semitism.
What we have is a blindness toward an entire people. There is the other anti-Semitism. There's the bigotry that grew up in the West during the same period that anti-Semitism flourished, the rise of the nation state. The Jew was seen as the threat from within, and the Arab and the Muslim were viewed as the threat from without. And both were caricatured in similar ways. Big noses, bloodthirsty. They controlled our wealth, and their wealth was ill-gotten because it really belonged to us. They lusted after our women, etc. I mean, they were portrayed in the most horrific fashions, both of them. We rightly condemned one. We ignored the other. The situation with Palestinians is a little different. They both have to endure the broader bigotry of the Arab world. But more importantly, as I wrote in the book, The Invisible Victims, they have literally been written out of the story. They don't exist in the consciousness of most Americans. The film, The Exodus, when it was made, was a deliberate piece of Israeli propaganda, Hasbara. It was funded to be that. They put the cowboy and Indian motif on the Israelis versus the Palestinians, so that the Israelis were the sweet young people, the young folks trying to carve out a home for themselves on the frontier and being blocked by these savages who were trying to destroy them, who didn't understand their yearning for freedom and a place to just be able to be. And the Palestinians were less than human. They became an objectified problem, the way Indians were in the lore of the West, as it was conveyed in film and in popular culture here in the States. And the Israelis actually fueled it. Founders of the Zionist movement portrayed themselves as a civilizing culture going against the uncivilized East. It was, as one of them said, a conflict between barbarism and humanity. We are, Max Nordau, one of the founders of the movement, said, we are the product of the West, the civilized West. They're the product of the uncivilized East. And they were going to not just bring civilization, but like the cowboys, like the pioneers and the Indians, they were going to clear the savages from the frontier like trees so that the people could survive. That was the Ben Gurion, less Arabs, more land argument. And so Palestinians in the language of the West literally became invisible as human beings. We cry for the Jewish suffering. We can't even speak about the Palestinian suffering because they're not real people to us. They don't exist. There are no Palestinian mothers or grandmothers. One Israeli minister, Ayelet Shaked, said that Palestinians are snakes and their mothers are the bearers of snakes and vermin, and so we needed to kill them, that they were all the same. That sense of dehumanizing, of making other an entire people, and listening to the rhetoric coming from the Israeli generals today about Gaza, it's as if there's no real people there, no real human beings there. We'll level the place. This is the home of 2.3 million people. We'll evict them from the north, and Gaza, when it's over, will be smaller and have less Arabs from Ben Gurion. But that's what the foreign minister was saying today. They want to expel them to Egypt and not let them back. That sense of they don't really exist as people. If what was being said about Palestinians were being said about Jews or any other people, we would rightly identify it as bigotry. We don't even pay attention to the fact that these are ministers, high-level ministers in the government. What's his name? Netanyahu gave a speech about the forces of light versus the forces of darkness, civilization confronting barbarism. He gave that just yesterday in the Knesset. And Biden is sitting with him today. We understand your people. We understand the suffering you've been. Of course we understand the suffering, but the cries of the Jewish people cannot drown out the cries of the Palestinian people. And yet that's what we've done.
And Joe Biden is over there while the Israelis have been destroying and bombing schools, apartment buildings, homes, electricity networks, water mains, hospitals, clinics, and well marked from the roof, United Nations relief agencies that have been there for years, having taken the lives of about 14 so far UN staff there. And the UN seems helpless here. Give us a little more context. There was a resolution 242 passed by the UN years ago. What is it, and how has it been treated by the United States and Israel?
It was a resolution calling for an end to the conflict. And basically, as it's been sort of put into a slogan, it created the formula of land for peace, that Israel could not continue to occupy militarily land seized in war, that it was called for the removal of the occupation, basically. And the U.S. supported it. It has been, as we say, honored more in the breach than in the observance. It's never been implemented. It was in every U.S. document up to Reagan, support for 242 and the formula of land for peace. That's been now ignored. And so if Israel were to surrender land, it would be as a gift. As Netanyahu says, they're asking us to do painful things. The painful thing being give them back their land. I remember when I met with Clinton after Camp David, he called me into the Oval Office to say, Barack made an offer. I need to get Arafat to counter, give me another offer. And I said, I've heard about Barack's offer. He's offering 1% of the territories occupied in 67. And he said, yeah, and the only offer Arafat keeps telling me is, he talks about 22%. What's that about? I said, Mr. President, you have to know the 22% is what's left of Palestine after Israel is the 78% of Palestine. He wants that back. And he said, well, Barack's offering part of that. And I said, he doesn't want part of it. He wants it. I said, you don't understand that for that generation of Palestinians, accepting Israel's 78% and writing off their rights in that 78%, that's a big deal. And offering them 90% of the 22% so that Israel can keep the settlements that literally still carve the West Bank up into pieces, or keep the Jordan Valley so that they don't have access to the outside world except through Israeli security. That's not peace. He didn't get it at all. He just didn't get it at all. And I don't think people here get it, because basically it's Israeli people versus the Palestine problem. And the solution is, how do we solve this pesky problem so that Israeli people can have freedom? It's not how do we deal with Palestinian humanity and their legitimate concerns as a real people who've suffered dispossession?
Well, let's talk about the current situation that focuses on Hamas's attack and the counterattack by Israel, powerful Air Force, Navy, land forces massing. Hamas was a tiny religious organization which was fostered into a more powerful organization by the United States and Israel. They thought that if they built up a religious organization, it would undermine the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. And once again, just as in Afghanistan, we create our own adversaries and blundering back and forth. Now, Hamas is now being focused on, but the focus should be on the order by the Israeli defense minister and the energy minister, who collectively ordered the soldiers and the military with the following words in the strike against Gaza. Quote, no power, no electricity, no food, no water, no gas. We are fighting human animals, end quotes. Those are the orders given. And as Bruce Fein, an international law practitioner, said in our program last week, this meets the definition of genocide. And he said, I'm quoting Bruce, the Genocide Convention born of the Holocaust defines the crime of genocide in Article 2C to include, quote, deliberately inflicting on a national, ethnic, and racial or religious group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, end quote. When you cut off water, food, electricity, fuel, you're condemning everybody, children, babies, women, men, to collective destruction. What is going on with a few of the progressives in Congress, and what do you see happening in the next few weeks?
Ralph, here's the thing. If you don't see Palestinians as real people, as people just as equal as Jewish people, even though Biden says the equal worth of both Israeli and Palestinian lives, they repeat that line ad nauseum, but do nothing about it. But if that's the way, if you don't see them as real people, then cutting off water, power, fuel, forcing them to be evicted doesn't matter to you. Imagine if that same thing were happening to Jews. Imagine if that same thing were happening to another people with whom we identify as human beings. But if you don't identify Palestinians as real people, then what the hell? It doesn't matter. It's just a tactic the Israelis are doing to become more secure. And so what the reaction will be in Congress is, leave me alone. I got no time for this. Or it'll be, hey, I'm really with you guys, but I can't do anything about it because, you know, I gotta run for office in November next year, and I gotta protect myself because, you know, they'll come after me. That's what you get. Either ignored completely because they don't care, or, hey, I'm really with you guys, but they remind me of the way the Pope used to appoint cardinals during the Soviet Union. He'd cardinals behind the Iron Curtain. He'd appoint them in his heart because he didn't want to reveal their name. So I have this club in my heart of members of Congress who I'm really with you guys, but, and that's as good as nothing. I got a call from somebody at the White House today saying, he sounded like, remember Digger Odell on the Old Life of Riley show, the sonorous funeral director? He said, I just want you to know that many of us here share your concern, and we're deeply upset that you're upset. And I just want you to know that we understand how you feel. It's like, I don't care if you understand how I feel. What I care about is, are you going to do something to change the situation? And they're not, because they're concerned about the politics of it. That's why they're not doing anything.
Well, according to the New York Times, the Israeli Air Force, using U.S. fighters and bombs, dropped 6,000 bombs on this tiny enclave the size of Philadelphia in area in the first week, which is more than the U.S. dropped in Afghanistan after 9/11 in a year. So we're dealing here with tremendous physical destruction, but also the mental damage to these little kids and these children. They cut off electricity and everything. People in hospitals are on ventilators and incubators with babies. And when all this is put forward, the Israeli government says it's all Hamas' fault. Brent Stevens writes an op-ed in the New York Times, just says it's all Hamas's fault. Well, there's never any admission of genocidal activity in Gaza, never any admission of overproportionality of collective punishment, which is illegal under international law. So we're dealing here with a situation enabled by the United States, funded by the U.S. taxpayer. The taxpayer is going to be, U.S. taxpayers are going to be given the bill from Netanyahu for this, and Senator Schumer is preparing it, a legislation, as the first installment. What do you want the American people to be doing here? And what groups in the United States are really standing up?
Well, there are progressive groups in the Jewish community that are great. They've really taken a lot on in leadership on this. There also are in the Black community, folks who have come to identify so strongly with this issue. They've also been important in the lead. We have support from the churches. We have support from peace groups. We have support from a lot of the civil rights groups, except for some of the historic civil rights groups. They've been far less sympathetic. Historically, they've been less sympathetic. But there is a movement that is not going to change. I mean, people said in the beginning, oh, this is going to kill the progressive support for Palestine. Far from it. Far from it. The Israeli behavior will only reinforce that mood among progressives where, as you just polled Democrats, period, the percent of Democrats who are sympathetic to Palestinians is about 11, 12 points higher than the percentage of Democrats who support Israel. It's different on the Republican side because everything's different on the Republican side. But there is this very strong support that I think needs to be understood as playing a role in the demonstrations we're seeing around the country. And it will grow, it'll grow over time. They've come to know Palestinian students on campuses. They've come to know Palestinians in the community. They've come to have a feeling about this issue that is radically different than the way Congress behaves, which is why we're seeing large numbers of progressives now running for office and making Palestine an issue, driving the pro-Israel groups a bit crazy, because given what's happening on campuses and given what's happening in the electoral arena, AIPAC starts raising tens of millions of dollars to defame, smear, and defeat people like Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush and Summer Lee, et cetera. You also have this effort to pass legislation in states banning the BDS movement and penalizing people for supporting boycotting Israel, and now expanding the definition of anti-Semitism to include legitimate criticism of Israel, which is now being used on college campuses to try to silence the debate. So they can't win the debate. What they have to try to do is silence the debate. That's not going to make it go away, and it's certainly not going to make more friends for Israel at the end of the day.
Well, the moral courage of Israeli human rights groups, especially in this kind of atmosphere, is really so commendable. And the moral courage of American Jews on this. Jewish Voice for Peace had a major demonstration at the White House and is part of a major demonstration before Congress this week. Let's go to the most ticklish issue at all here. Given the pending negotiations of the U.S. with Saudi Arabia and others, given the indifference to the Palestinian issue by Israelis, as Gideon Levy has written in Haaretz, the young generation of Israelis hardly gave a thought as they build their technological economy, hardly give a thought to what's going on a few miles away in the West Bank and Gaza. What do you think was in the minds of Hamas in the attack on October 6th? What was the strategic and tactical goal, and what were they most fearful of if they didn't raise the Palestinian issue in the brutal way that they did?
I'm going to be very honest with you. I've written about this because I cannot understand what was in their minds. They had to know what would happen the day after. And if they didn't know what happened the day after, then in addition to being brutal, they were also stupid. To me, there was no strategy here. There was no sense that we do this and then that will happen and then this will happen and here's the logical outcome. I mean, despite the fact that he himself violated it by going into Iraq, the Powell Doctrine, to me, makes sense. I don't believe you ever go to war, but if you go to war, Powell said, you have to know the consequences. You have to know the terms of it. You have to have an exit strategy. You have to have a sense of how this is going to contribute to victory. And you have to be able to define victory. I can't imagine that Hamas had any sense of any of that when they did what they did. I think they struck out blindly to murder people and without paying attention to what would happen to their own people. afterwards. That's the first part. The second part is that I don't think Israelis, the leadership, adhere to the Powell Doctrine either, because their behavior in the last several days since this attack has demonstrated that all they wanted to do was kill as many people as possible, create fear, panic, evict people from their homes. And the outcome is that we're going to be right back where we started, with a lot more dead people, a lot more angry people. The other party, who I don't think had any sense of adherence to any doctrine, is the United States. Joe Biden, I'm sure, doesn't understand, but there had to be people in the administration who said, Mr. President, we can't come out with full-throated support for Israel and what they're doing. We can say, yes, this was terrible what happened, and we condemn it, and we support your right to defend yourself, but you can't defend yourself in a way that takes the lives of thousands of innocent people, as they're now doing. And we will not support that. And so you better be careful what you do. We didn't do that. Instead, we just said, go get them, guys. We're not going to offer any criticism. And the result is that everybody in this is losing. The Palestinians are losing, the Israelis are losing, and ultimately the United States is losing, as we can see on the streets across the Arab world.
There's also an internal issue. Israel is very divided over the usurpation of the jurisdiction of the judiciary. Right. Netanyahu was in hot water, and a very strong pro-Zionist American who just went to Israel is raising the question, why did it take 5 or 6 hours before the Israeli military began responding to the assault on October 6th?
Because 75% of the Israeli military was in the West Bank protecting settlers and settlements. That's why. That's why. Because they were brutalizing the West Bank. That's why. And, it was a stupid move on the part of Hamas, but they confronted a brutal enemy who was willing to pay any price at all to kill as many people as they could in order to exact a toll on Palestinians. The problem is the United States did nothing to restrain Israel. In fact, State Department issued 2 statements, one calling for restraint, one calling for protection of civilians, and calling for a ceasefire. And both statements were taken off the website within hours and replaced with, we support Israel's right to do anything it needs to defend its own people. That was just criminal.
And then there's verbal censorship at the State Department. Before we go to Steve and the questions, tell us about this internal memorandum that leaked to the press about what phrases should not be used by the State Department, whose charter 200 years ago was diplomacy and customs, not war.
Yeah, well, they issued a statement banning the use of words like restraint or ceasefire, and you get what you get. What you get is unrestrained Israel doing the worst it possibly can to make life as miserable as possible for Palestinians, and committing, as you suggest, as you say, genocide, which is what is happening.
Which, of course, involves U.S. as a co-belligerent, even under international law.
We're an accomplice. We're an accomplice to war crimes.
And the last point I want to run by you, Jim, is in 2014, when there was another war in Gaza with Israel, there was a 5-day truce. And the question is, can there be a temporary truce now to negotiate the release of the hostages controlled by Hamas now in tunnels in Gaza, and the prisoners in Israeli jails who have been imprisoned for years without due process or even charges, including youngsters? What do you think of the chance of that, just to temper the process for a few days? What do you think Joe Biden should come back to the U.S. with?
That has been proposed, and it has been rejected by the U.S. government as an approach. They've completely rejected it. And they are reaping what they sow. And I just can't tell you how frustrating it is to deal with this administration. We had more of an opportunity, more of a sense that people were listening, even in the Bush years. I can't say Trump, but this administration has been completely deaf to any proposals that went differently than what the president is currently doing, which is offering complete, unquestioning support for Israel. And what they tell me is that he's quietly telling Netanyahu things that are critical. Netanyahu never responds to quiet diplomacy. They pocket this. They say, good. Oh, thank you very much. Good. And then they ignore it. If it's not public, it might as well not be being done. They should know that by now, but they don't.
There's a risk of a wider war here. If the Israelis begin provoking areas outside, they've been bombing, by their own estimates, hundreds of times in Syria. Just a few days ago, they bombed the international civilian airport in Damascus. And if there's a wider war here, the U.S. is going to get involved in it.
Yeah, we have 2 warships off the coast, and we have 2,000 Marines on the way. And I'm wondering to myself, what the hell are they thinking? Don't they remember what happened in Beirut, after the 82 invasion when we got hundreds of Marines killed? Don't they remember Iraq? Is that too distant for them to remember the blunder we made? We should never get involved in a war in a part of the world whose history we don't understand, whose culture we don't understand, and whose grievances against America we don't understand. It's mind-numbing, Ralph, that after all this time, I'm dealing with people at the White House who couldn't find some of these countries on the map before they got the job 5 years ago. And they're making policy decisions about a part of the world that we've messed up for decades. And they're messing it up even worse.
And U.S. military families, as they suffered in Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course, civilian deaths in Iraq were far, far greater than U.S. soldier deaths by far. 1 million Iraqis were killed, at least, by Bush and Cheney's criminal war of invasion there. But you have Hillary Clinton, for example, who voted for the Iraq war. Afterwards, she said it was a mistake. That's the way they treat millions of casualties in these Arab countries that are invaded by the U.S. as a mistake. So with all that, we're looking for diplomacy. We're looking for the American people to say stop, the way they did when Obama asked the Congress to send U.S. soldiers in Syria. 95% of the comments coming into Congress from Republican and Democrat voters said stop. And that seems to be the only hope when they read the tea leaves in public opinion in the U.S. Let's go to Steve.
Mr. Zogby, talk to me about the Anti-Defamation League as a source of information for Americans. What would your assessment of them be?
Number one, their history has been betrayed by their attitude over the last several decades. They've gone from being an anti-defamation league that was always on the right, on the right wing, to a group that has almost become solely focused on Israel and on defaming people who are critical of Israel. They've even conflated criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and they've sought to silence groups, and they've tarnished groups like Jewish Voice for Peace that Ralph just mentioned as anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, even though they're Jewish. They've done the same with Black Lives Matter. They've done the same with the student groups on campuses and other groups as well. And when it comes even to the Arab community, they are famous for, in the 80s, for example, they had a spy on the West Coast who was working undercover in Arab groups and providing documents to the FBI about these groups, and included people like former Congressman Pete McCloskey, who was a congressman at the time, and people who I knew out there there was no one who was involved in any terrorist activity. They were Arab American organizers and Arab American community activists and business leaders. And finally, there was a lawsuit against the ADL, which Pete McCloskey and the group who were co-defendants with him won, because the ADL had turned its mission into a spying and defaming Arab Americans. And that's a lot of what they do these days. And I am, obviously really distressed at it, because they still have the name legacy of, oh my God, it's the ADL. Well, they defend Jewish people against anti-Semitism. But what they do, they've become one of the main proponents of anti-Arab bigotry and anti-Arab sentiment by accusing us, when we criticize Israel, of being an anti-Semite, which we're not. And we're not because we know that anti-Semitism means hatred of the Jewish people and hatred of groups because they are Jewish and because there are somehow felt to be internal qualities that are shared by all Jews that characterize them. And it can be negative or positive. Somebody who says, well, Jews are cheats, or Jews are money grubbers, or Jews are this, that's bigotry. But those like Trump who say, yeah, Jews are really good with money, that's also bigotry and anti-Semitism. Finding, in any case, whether you're talking about Arabs, talking about Jews, talking about Chinese, any behavior that treats another people as if, number one, they're all the same and they have internal or innate qualities that define them and that are immutable, that can't be changed because they're Jews or they're Arabs and you know what they're like. That's bigotry. And the ADL has fallen into that trap because what they've done is they have literally portrayed every Arab American who is a defender of Palestinians as a bigot, which is itself a form of bigotry because they put an entire community at risk.
Well, we're out of time. We've been talking with Jim Zogby, the founder of the Arab American Institute. Jim, is there any last-minute point you want to make to our listeners?
A lot of the questions that have been asked, Ralph, by you and Hannah in particular, I deal with in the book, Palestinians, the Invisible Victims. And I'd sure like to send people a copy if they want to write to me at jzogby@aaiusa.org or DM me on Twitter it's at JJZ1600. The Invisible Victims, I wrote it back in '78, and folks at Mondo Weiss looked at it a few years back and said, this book ought to be published today. It's exactly relevant to the conversation today. I looked at it and said, it was great. So we actually reissued it. It's a very short book, but it traces the history of Zionism and the oppression of Palestinians and how the two were connected.
And give that contact number slowly once more.
It's jzogby@aaiusa.org, or they can DM me on Twitter at JJZ1600 1600.
Thank you very much, Jim Zogby.
We'll send a copy. Thanks.
We've been speaking with James Zogby. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, Harvey Wasserman joins us to talk about the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Report in 1 minute for Friday, October 20, 2023. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the Federal Trade Commission are cracking down on junk fees. Junk fees are hidden surprise fees that companies sneak into customer bills, increasing costs and stifling competition. Junk fees cost American families tens of billions of dollars each year. Junk fees may take many forms, including fees for late penalties, overdrafts, returns, using an out-of-network ATM, money transfers, inactivity, and more. With overdraft fees, a cup of coffee can go from $3 to $35. When an individual needs help, they may even be charged a fee for speaking to a real person. And some companies charge you to pay your bill by phone or other methods. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with Hannah Feldman and Ralph. Could contract law help activists prevent a nuclear disaster in Diablo Canyon? Hannah?
Harvey Wasserman is a journalist, author, democracy activist, and advocate for renewable energy. Mr. Wasserman is the author of Solartopia, Our Green-Powered Earth, and The People's Spiral of U.S. History. He has written and researched atomic energy since 1973 and co-authored Killing Our Own, The Disaster of America's Experience with Atomic Energy. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Harvey Wasserman.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's always great to talk to you and to Ralph.
Listeners should know that Harvey Wasserman is one of a kind. There's no way to fully describe the wide array of injustices that he has not demonstrated against, picketed against, organized against all over the United States, and written about. In fact, in his book, The People's Spiral in U.S. History, Howard Zinn, who wrote his own People's History of the U.S., said, quote, Harvey Wasserman constantly provokes us and educates us, sometimes outrages us, often inspires us. He is always delightfully readable, end quote. But your concern right now is the increasing brittlement of U.S. nuclear plants all over the country. That's aging U.S. nuclear plants that could lead not just to a nuclear disaster in traditional ways, like breaking through the containment and releasing radioactivity, but actually lead to an explosion. And your focus is on the Diablo Canyon 2 nuclear plants in California, the only nuclear plants operating that are left in California, a state predicted to have 100 nuclear plants by the year 2000. Obviously, that never happened. So tell us the immediate problem of extending the operating life of the Diablo Canyon plants, which were slated to close down by Governor Newsom and his protection of this criminally negligent giant utility, Pacific Gas and Electric in California.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ralph. And we really are in crisis mode on a number of fronts here. There are 94 reactors left in the United States, commercial reactors. They are instruments of global warming and mass suicide. They operate at 570 degrees Fahrenheit every day. I'd like someone to tell me how you cool the planet with a radioactive fire that burns at 570 degrees Fahrenheit. They also emit carbon, especially carbon-14, and a lot of carbon in the nuclear fuel cycle. But the bottom line here is that all these old reactors are embrittled. Embrittlement is a process that occurs when a piece of metal is exposed for decades to heat, pressure, and radiation, which all the internal components of nuclear power plants are subjected to. And with embrittlement, you have a situation where, if God forbid, there's an accident and they have to pour in water to cool the radioactive chain reaction going on, the embrittled reactor core will shatter. And if, God forbid, the reactor core shatters, you will have steam, hydrogen, and nuclear explosions, as we've seen at Chernobyl and Fukushima. It could not be more serious. And the reactors at Diablo Canyon, there's two of them there, and they opened in the 1980s, despite 10,000 people being arrested, including me. I spent 3 lovely nights in the San Luis Obispo County Jail. I highly recommend it. But we tried to stop them from going online. They operated since the mid-1980s. In 2016, a deal was signed to shut them down and to phase them out. And Gavin Newsom was lieutenant governor at the time, and he signed that deal. And last year, he stabbed us in the back. And Ralph, we can never, ever trust Gavin Newsom for anything, because what he's doing now is attempting to keep open these 2 reactors, despite the fact that they're deeply flawed internally and surrounded by literally a dozen earthquake faults. And the NRC's own inspector has said that Diablo Canyon cannot withstand a likely earthquake. So we are building a state and a nationwide movement to keep these 2 old reactors shut. Right now, Diablo Unit 1 is actually shut for refueling. We want it never to reopen. Newsom is refusing to allow us a public inspection. They are PG&E, which is a convicted criminal of more than 90 manslaughter counts because they blew up a pipe in San Bruno and incinerated 8 human beings, and then they burned down much of Northern California, killing over 80 people. Well, this is a criminal operation, Ralph. And they are continuing to be allowed to operate these 2 nuclear plants that could really cause an apocalyptic release of radiation. And one thing we have to understand is that all the nuclear plants in the United States today are essentially military facilities. The idea that no nuclear plant in the United States can compete now with wind and solar. In California, we get very substantially more electricity from rooftop solar than we do from Diablo Canyon. There are 1,500 people working at Diablo Canyon. There are 70,000 people installing solar panels in California. There's only one explanation why they're continuing to operate these 2 reactors and all the other reactors in the United States, and that's because the commercial reactor industry is now the infrastructure of the nuclear weapons industry. If you like nuclear power, you love nuclear weapons. They are joined at the hip, these 2 industries, and that's why the federal government keeps intervening to keep these old reactors shut when they are incredibly dangerous. And people need to write to mothersforpeace.org, mothersforpeace.org, which is the principal operation opposing Diablo Canyon. But Ralph, this could not be more serious. These 2 reactors are upwind of the entire United States. An accident at Diablo Canyon could within 4 hours, send an apocalyptic radioactive cloud into Los Angeles, into the Central Valley, where we get our fruits and vegetables over the winter and into the Bay Area. The stakes could not be higher. And again, these are military facilities masquerading as fighters of global warming, which is absolutely ridiculous. You pioneered this movement. I was with you in 1973 and 4 at the critical mass conferences in DC. And we've done tremendous work, Ralph. In that year, 74, Richard Nixon said there'd be 1,000 nuclear reactors in the United States by the year 2000. In the year 2000, there were 104. Now we're down to 94, but all these reactors are very old, very dangerous, and they need to shut as soon as possible.
As you know, the two Indian Point reactors 30 miles north of Manhattan have been shut down, and Governor Andrew Cuomo was insistent that that be done. And New York's not suffering from an electricity shortage. There's huge areas of conservation of electricity, by the way, that will give us far more electric power by saving megawatts instead of building megawatts nuclear power style. Just to be specific, Harvey, give us the timeline. You got 2 reactors at Diablo Canyon and near an earthquake zone. Are they operating one now? And when were they supposed to be closed? What year? And what year has Governor Newsom given them as an extension? And by the way, further subsidized them?
Well, yeah. So the state of California, he's kicking in $1.1 billion to keep these reactors open. It's absolutely insane. And another $1.4 billion coming from the federal government. The only reason they're doing this, Ralph, is for nuclear weapons. The 40-year license on the 2 reactors at Diablo was supposed to expire in 24 and 25. In other words, in the next 2 years. And the deal that was cut with the state of California, the assembly, the utilities company itself, the regulators, the unions, the local governments, and the environmental groups in 2016 said that these 2 reactors would shut next year in 24 and the year after in 25. Newsom signed that deal, and suddenly he waltzed in last year and is abrogating the deal. It's outrageous and completely illegal, Ralph. They are breaking the law 40 different ways from Sunday. We're in federal court now and trying to get the NRC to at least inspect these reactors. They don't want to inspect them. They don't want the public to know how bad internally they are. And I got to tell you, the great miracle since the critical mass conferences that you did way back when is the rise of renewables. Renewable energy, wind and solar, along with battery technology, which is about to make a major breakthrough, switching from lithium to sodium. These technologies have advanced so much faster and so much more effectively than anybody thought was possible. There is absolutely no doubt that we can convert the entire global economy to renewables, wind, solar, batteries, efficiency, all of that stuff in a very rapid period of time. And what's standing in our way is nuclear power and fossil fuels. Nuclear power completely screws up the grid. It does it all the time in California. They're running Diablo Canyon. Right now they're refueling, but when they're running Diablo Canyon, the electricity from the nuclear plant takes up the space on the grid that could be going to far cheaper wind and solar. It's outrageous. Everything we envisioned 50 years ago has come true in terms of the benefits of wind and solar.
What you're saying has been said many times on our program by the late David Freeman, who was the head of the Tennessee Valley Authority, as well as utilities in Sacramento and Los Angeles. Harvey, I want you to explain to our listeners the connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons.
Well, what's happened is, Ralph, that we have successfully shut many of the key pieces of the nuclear weapons infrastructure. Rocky Flats, Hanford, Fernald, Ashtabula, many of our activism against nuclear weapons has been extremely effective. So now what they're doing, the government's putting all its eggs in the basket at Portsmouth in Southern Ohio. They want to expand uranium enrichment and do all sorts of things to make plutonium available and enriched uranium for these depleted uranium weapons. And how you fuel, HALEU, which is supposed to be for these ridiculous new reactors that are never going to get built. And they're using they're going to use the spent fuel and other pieces of the infrastructure for the commercial atomic reactors. And so the commercial atomic reactors are now the new infrastructure for the atomic weapons industry. And I'll give you a very clear picture. The Prime Minister of France, Macron, has very explicitly said that without nuclear power, you don't have nuclear weapons. And without nuclear weapons, you don't have nuclear power. The first solar panels were invented at Bell Labs in 53 and 54. If we had gone that route instead of the nuclear route, we would not have a global warming problem. We would be infinitely richer. We would be fully employed because renewables employ way, way, way more people than nuclear power or fossil fuels. There are more people working in California on solar alone in California than there are digging coal in the whole United States.
You want people to connect with mothersforpeace.org, and how can they connect? In what way?
Well, the Mothers have a great website. They've been active for 50 years, and they're a great group. They're right there in San Luis Obispo. You can also contact me at solartopia.org, mothersforpeace.org, mothersforpeace, that's one word, .org, and they are doing the legal intervention. Ralph, if we covered every rooftop, every usable rooftop in the United States with solar and did nothing else, we could power this country twice over. I mean, it's ridiculous.
We're out of time. Thank you very much, Harvey Wasserman, author of the book, The People's Spiral in U.S. History, and also the leader in the movement that he calls Solartopia. Go to mothersforpeace.org if you want to get involved in this effort. Thank you very much, Harvey.
Hey, thank you. And listen, if you want a piece of music, go to YouTube and look for Pete Seeger, Solartopia. Pete Seeger, I once approached Pete and asked him to write a song about Solartopia, and he did, for God's sakes. And it's on YouTube, and you could use the music. It's really cool.
I want to thank our guests again, James Zogby and Harvey Wasserman. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis, and in case you haven't heard, a transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel, and for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
Saturday, October 28th is Tort Law Education Day at the American Museum of Tort Law. Join Ralph Saturday, October 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern for the museum's free virtual panel. Go to tortmuseum.org to register.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. The next issue, The Capitol Hill Citizen, is coming soon.
Step up, step up. I think